of January 6, 1999. The gentleman from Vermont, Mr. Sanders, is recognized for 60 minutes as a designee of the minority leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It has always seemed to me that the major crisis that we face as a country is not that we do not know the answers to the most serious problems that we face, but rather, for a variety of reasons, we refuse to ask the right questions. As the only independent in the Congress, I want to raise some issues that are usually ignored by most of my Democratic colleagues and most of my Republican colleagues, and are often ignored by the mass media as well. And let me start off with one question that I think is the most important of all, and that is, why is it that tens and tens of millions of people in our country, most especially the young people, are giving up on the political process? Why is it that virtually every day we become a less and less democratic and participatory society? Why is it that in the last election in November of 1998, only 36% of the American people bothered to vote, which was the lowest turnout that we have had in many years? And this compares, as you know, Mr. Speaker, with a recent election that took place in Israel, where 90% of the eligible people voted, compared to 36% in the United States. And it is not uncommon in Canada, in Europe, in Scandinavia to have elections in which 70 or 80 or 90% of eligible voters participate. Why is that? Why is that so many people say, oh, democracy, oh, voting, oh, participating in the political system? Don't be silly. I wouldn't think of doing that. Now, as bad as the general situation is, as bad as a 36% voter turnout is, what is even worse and more frightening is that in the last election, if you can believe it, only 18% of the young people under 24 years of age voted. That means 82% of people 24 years of age or younger did not vote. And that in itself is a very serious situation. But what is even more frightening is that we know that by and large, if people do not vote and participate when they are young, they are much less likely to vote as they age. So that means that everything being equal, as low as our voter turnout is right now, it is likely that in years to come, it will become even lower. Now, not only is the voter turnout among young people distressingly low, but what is also very frightening is that polls indicate that young people know very little about the political process. There was a poll recently done by the National Association of Secretaries of State. And what they discovered, they asked young people 3 questions. They said, very hard question, can you name the Vice President of the United States? Pretty hard question. Can you name the governor of your state? Pretty hard question. And lastly, they said, how long is a congressional term? How long do members of Congress serve? Those are not very hard questions. Those are questions that we would hope the kids in the 6th grade would know, and yet 3/4 of the young people 24 years of age and younger were unable to answer that question. And poll after poll shows not only that young people, but people of all ages have very little understanding of what our budget is about, of how appropriations are made, of how they can participate in the political process. I go to many, many schools in the state of Vermont because I think it's important for a member of Congress to do that. And what you find is that people in Vermont, young people and people all over this country, they know the rules of basketball. They know that when you throw a ball through a hoop, you make 2 points. They know all about football. You score 6 points when you make a touchdown, 1 point, an extra point, 2 points if you throw a pass. They know all about that. Field hockey. They know hockey. They know all of these things. And yet you say, well, tell me something, young people. Are you concerned about the high cost of college? And the young people say, oh, yeah, $20,000, $30,000. My family can't afford that. And then you say to them, okay, from a democratic political perspective, how do you change that? How do you make your voice heard? How do you fight to make sure that the federal government helps middle class and working families better able to go to college and to pay for college tuition? Gee, I don't know. I have no clue. How do you do that? We don't know how you do that. Well, the reality is that if young people came together on that issue and they said to the United States Congress, get your priorities right, put more money into Pell Grants, put more money into higher education so that middle class and working families can afford to get to college. And if you don't do that, members of Congress, we're not going to vote for you. And then if a few million young people said that, you know what? Just like that, suddenly the members of Congress would wake up and say, oh, golly gee, college education, very expensive. We're going to deal with that. Maybe we're going to cut back on corporate welfare. Maybe we're going to cut back on tax breaks for the rich. But that is not going to happen unless young people participate in the political process. So the first point that I want to make is that I consider the most serious problem facing this country is the growing alienation of the American people, and especially the young people, from politics and government. And not only does that alienation mean that working people and young people are going to be less able to achieve their goals through the political process, it means something else. In my view, it is an insult to the men and women who have put their lives on the line defending American democracy that people are not utilizing our democratic system. Clearly, we are not going to have a democratic system if people don't utilize it and participate in it. And if ordinary folks, if working people, if low-income people, if young people do not participate in the political process, who do you think is going to fill the gap? And the answer is quite clear. The people who have the money, the people who have the power want nothing more than for the American people and for working people and young people and elderly people. They want those people not to participate in the political process. Why is that? Well, because then their money can have an even greater impact over the political process than it has right now. Today, we have the outrageous situation that the wealthiest 1/4% of the American population makes 80% of the campaign contributions. And then you combine that with the fact that only 36% of the people vote, and you end up with a Congress that does exactly what this Congress does, and that is to represent the interest of the wealthy and the powerful. And it seems to me if young people are serious about education, what do you think education is? It means learning how to participate, learning how to use your ideas to make this country and your community and this world a little bit better place. So you are cheating yourself, and you are demeaning the education that you have received if you are not participating. I am delighted that I am being joined this evening by Congressman Peter DeFazio of Oregon. I am proud that I chaired the Progressive Caucus here in Congress, which now has some 55 members, for 8 years, and I'm delighted that Congressman DeFazio is now the chair of the Progressive Caucus, and he has been a valiant fighter for working people and the elderly and people who do not make the $50,000 contributions to both political parties, and I'm delighted, Congressman, that you're with us this evening. Peter?
Thank you. Thanks, Bernie. Just to expand on your point, and I think it's a statistic the American people need to pay attention to. It's 1/4% of the people in America gave more than $200 to a political campaign last year, and yet constituted 80% of the contributions. So who do you think's in the Republican leader's office when the decisions are being made on tax relief, or on reforming Social Security, or on whether or not we're going to have HMO reform that gives patients rights. Guess what? The insurance company executives are in the office, not the patients, not the people who desperately need access to health care and can't get it because their HMO is more interested in profits than in their health care. Guess who's in those offices when we're talking about tax reform? Now, we could do some tax reform around here that would benefit the majority of the working people in America. In fact, I've introduced some legislation to reform Social Security that would vouchsafe Social Security for 75 years, certified by the Board of Trustees, and it would give tax relief to 95% of the wage-earning Americans in this country. It's simple. Right now, you pay Social Security tax on your first $72,600 of income. After that, you don't pay Social Security tax. If you earn $1 million a year, your tax rate under Social Security is less than 1%. If you earn $15,000 a year, your tax rate on Social Security, which is part of the FICA, is 6%. You pay 6 times more out of a meager income on which you can't make ends meet. So if we just lifted the cap and said, fair's fair, all these people want to talk about a flat tax, well, let's make Social Security a flat tax on all income. Not a regressive, super regressive flat tax, which is only on the first $72,600 of income. That would vouchsafe Social Security into the indefinite future, but you can also use some of that money to give a $4,000 exemption from FICA tax. 40% or 45% of Americans pay more in taxes to Social Security than they pay in income taxes. 95% of Americans would benefit under that system. Everybody who earned less than $76,000 a year would get a tax break. But guess what? The same people are sitting in the leaders of the office of the Ways and Means Committee and the Republican leader's office when I talk about a progressive Social Security reform, something to make this vital program safe, and saying, you better worry about your campaign contributions here. If you raise my taxes, they want to tax the little people, and they want tax relief at the top. So it's time to change the system, but it isn't going to change, as Congressman Sanders pointed out, until more people who have more on the line choose to vote. And that's the majority of the American people who are losing under the current system. Now, often I give speeches like this on the floor, and I've had colleagues and friends from the Republican side of the aisle say, you're talking about class warfare, DeFazio. We don't want class warfare around here, is what they say. Well, that's not the truth. What they want is they want to continue the current class warfare, which is winning warfare against middle income and working families and the poor in America, to the advantage of that 1/2% at the top. That's what they want to perpetuate. So they don't want to talk about it. They don't want the truth out there. And it goes to so many issues. It goes to Social Security reform. It could be progressive. It goes to trade. I hope you don't mind if I switch to trade for a moment.
Before you do.
Okay, go ahead.
Trade is certainly an issue that you and I have worked together very hard on. I wanted to pick up on a point that you made. When we talk about campaign contributions, let us be demonstrative and very clear what we mean when we talk about the wealthiest 1/4% making 80% of the campaign contributions. Now, one of the issues that I have been working on very hard for the last several years, and is an issue of great, great concern in my state of Vermont among the elderly, among almost the entire population, is the outrageously high cost of prescription drugs. In the United States today, we have by far, it ain't even close, the highest cost for prescription drugs of any country in the industrialized world. And many of those drugs are manufactured by American companies. They sell it to Canada far cheaper than they sell it to Americans. They sell it to Mexicans far cheaper than they sell it to those of us in the United States. They sell it throughout Europe. Now, how is that? One of the answers lies in the fact that the pharmaceutical industry spends more money on campaign contributions and lobbying than any other industry in the United States. In the first 18 months of the last election cycle, leading up to the 1998 campaign, they spent over $83 million on lobbying and campaign contributions. Today, in a Washington publication, there is an article which says that the pharmaceutical industry is becoming very nervous. They're becoming very nervous because all over this country, people are saying, we can't afford to pay these outrageously high prices for prescription drugs. It is obscene that elderly people have to choose between food and prescription drugs. And here in Congress, many of us are now saying, let us have Medicare include prescription drugs so that elderly people don't have to make that choice. Well, what do we read in the paper today? We read that the pharmaceutical industry is now prepared to spend between $20 and $30 million on TV ads and on lobbying so that Congress does not protect the elderly and the sick in terms of prescription drugs. And that's how life goes and will continue to go until we have real campaign finance reform. So at a time when the pharmaceutical industry last year had the biggest increase in profits of any industry, over 18%, when the top 10 pharmaceutical companies had an average increase in profits of over 26%. What they do is they take those profits, they put it into lobbying, they put it into campaign funds of members of Congress so that their interests are protected and we continue to have the highest price for prescription drugs in the country. And I would yield back.
Well, I'd like to expand on that because this is very important to my constituents. And in a minute, I'll talk about a study that was just done in my district on prescription drug prices. But I'll just give a personal example. There's a drug called Lomotil that you take for if you get an intestinal problem and you're traveling overseas. And my wife and I, on a private trip, were traveling overseas. And my doctor said, you ought to take some of this with you. He gave me a prescription. Okay, I went to a local pharmacy, and the pharmacies aren't the ones that are ripping us off on this, and that's something the American people need to know. They need to know where to focus their anger, and it's not on the pharmacists, because they're paying more than the drug company is selling the drug for to other customers. But the pills were about $1 each. I got to India. I was sick. I was out of the pills. I went into a local pharmacy there. Same manufacturer, exactly the same drug, made in America. That was good. I was happy to have a made-in-America drug. 6 cents per pill. Now, somehow that pill is shipped from the United States to India and sold with all the middlemen in India at a profit at 6 cents. But here in America, I have to pay $1. You go just north of the border to Canada, and in fact, because the government is exacting some controls and scrutiny on the pharmaceutical industry, the drugs cost between 20 and 40% less, sometimes even more.
That's right.
It's extraordinary. And these are life-saving drugs that Americans need. I've talked to seniors who say, Congressman, I got to choose between paying my light bill and my heat, eating, the mortgage, and my drugs for my high blood pressure or my cholesterol or my heart condition or whatever ails them. And they say, you know what goes? And I said, I know what goes. The prescription. Some of them are taking prescriptions and they'll buy half the prescription and they'll take drugs at half the dose because they can't afford a full dose of the drugs. And the funny thing is that these same drugs, even in America, are sold for less. Now that is getting really peculiar. You can understand there's some government scrutiny overseas, and they're not, the government's there around allowing the pharmaceutical companies to rob people blind. But here in America, you find in my district in Oregon, we just did a drug study. Let's take one drug called Zocor, which is made by Merck. It's used for high cholesterol, quite commonly by seniors. And for favored customers, that is for companies that will promise to only buy that drug because they're competing drugs from Merck, some insurance industries, HMO plans and others who will make their insureds buy that particular drug no matter what the doctor wants to give them. That will be the formulary. It's $34.80 a dose. Now if a senior walks in with Medicare, which doesn't cover prescription drugs today, the price in my district is $106.12. Now that's interesting. We know Merck isn't giving it away at $34.80. They're making money to their best customers. But somehow the poor little old senior who walks in, who doesn't have one of those plans, is paying $106.12, 205% more. That is a scandal, and that needs to change. But it's not going to change in this body because, as Congressman Sanders pointed out, that industry is a very generous contributor to campaigns, not mine, but to other members. And the executives of that industry are very generous givers to campaigns, and they've got the ear of many powerful members of Congress. Here's something that cries out for regulation. Here's something that's being done in other democracies and republics around the world, but not in the United States of America. It's outrageous. I would certainly yield.
The gentleman would yield, because I know he shares with me the outrage that people throughout this country are suffering and dying and are forced to take money out of their food budget or their heat budget in order to pay for the outrageously high cost of prescription drugs. What we have learned is that in terms of the drugs that seniors use, and I don't know that it's different for the general population, but in terms of seniors' needs, in my state of Vermont, the most commonly used drugs by seniors cost 81% more in the state of Vermont than they do in Canada. Same exact drugs manufactured by companies, American companies, and they cost 112% more in Vermont than they do in Mexico. Now, let me also mention some other information. You mentioned about how the cost of drugs in India, or at least one particular drug, was significantly cheaper, the same exact product, in the same exact bottle, than you purchase here in the United States. In terms of the drugs most commonly used by seniors, if we use a figure of $1 for a drug paid in the United States, in Germany, that same product would cost 71 cents, in Sweden, 68 cents, in the United Kingdom, 65 cents, in Canada, 64 cents, France, 57 cents, and Italy, 51 cents, half price in Italy. Meanwhile, the drug companies are experiencing record-breaking profits, and they spend that money very freely here in Washington in campaign contributions and in lobbying. So I would just yield back to my friend.
Well, you know, I'd like to just congratulate the gentleman on legislation he's tried to pass here in the House a couple of times, which, embarrassingly enough for the House of Representatives, we've yet to be successful on, which is to say, when the drug is developed with public research, that the government, the taxpayers, would be reimbursed. Many of the most successful drugs were not from the pharmaceutical. That's what they'll say. Well, we need those obscene profits to invest in research. That's not where the money goes. It goes to stockholders, the chief executive officers, you know, and other places. Yes, some of it goes into research, but not an inordinate amount. And in fact, many of the most successful drugs are a result of research done by the National Institutes of Health. And when a private company takes their research and produces and markets a drug with exclusive rights for 8 to 10 years, has happened recently with a drug for uterine cancer. This was doubly ironic. Not only was the research done and the drug developed by the National Institutes of Health at total taxpayer expense, the product, before they developed an artificial one, which produced the drug, was harvested off of federal lands, UBARC. So this company was given not only the exclusive right to use and sell these drugs, which were taxpayer created, but they were also given exclusive rights to go out and harvest the UBARC off of federal lands, and no controls were put on their profits. Right. None. That is absolutely obscene. And the gentleman has tried over a number of years to say, here's a simple principle. If a drug company takes the public research, patents it, and puts it into a drug, that we should get some reimbursement. The taxpayers should get some reimbursement for that drug development. You might even talk about that.
All right, thank you. The bottom line is very simple. The taxpayers of this country have spent appropriately billions of dollars in research through the National Institute of Health to develop very important anti-cancer drugs, anti-AIDS drugs, and many other types of drugs. And we've had a good result. What the outrage is that after the taxpayer pays for the development and the research of that drug, what we have right now is the government then simply gives over that product to the private pharmaceutical company, which can charge any price it wants. So the taxpayer gets screwed twice. After you pay for the research, then you have to pay some outrageous price to purchase that product. I want to say a word about another. We're going to continue on that legislation, and we're going to bring it up as soon as we can on the floor of the House. But I want to mention another piece of legislation that we have recently introduced, and that is that given the reality of what goes on right now, that the price for American prescription drugs are sold in Canada and Mexico far, far cheaper than in the United States. I have legislation which would do a very simple thing. You know, we're going to talk about trade in a minute, and a lot of the folks here think, oh, free trade is a great idea. You and I have problems with certain aspects of quote-unquote free trade. But here's something very interesting. If a prescription drug distributor in the United States wanted to do business with a distributor in Canada and wanted to purchase a prescription drug there at the same price that the Canadians are able to purchase it from American companies, that is currently illegal. See, the theory of free enterprise is that a business person can go shopping around and get the best price and the consumer benefits and everything else. It is a nice theory, I guess, except it does not apply, NAFTA notwithstanding, to prescription drugs. So right now, an American distributor cannot negotiate with a Canadian distributor to purchase a prescription drug at the same price as the Canadians are getting it. So we have very simple conservative legislation in that says, let the free market work. And when you have exactly the same product approved by the FDA, let American prescription drug distributors get the best price, sell it to the pharmacists. And as Peter indicated a moment ago, the problem is not with the pharmacist in the United States. He or she is paying significantly higher prices than pharmacists all over the world. And we're saying, hey, let's have a level playing field. Let's have a little free trade when it comes to protecting the American consumer. So this is a piece of legislation that we look forward to bringing to the floor of the House and passing. And I would yield to my friend.
In fact, speaking further to that issue, some seniors in border states have actually formed little clubs and rented buses to go across the border to pick up their needed drugs, their life-saving drugs, at an incredibly cheaper price. And now, of course, I understand the Border Patrol is starting to crack down on that.
Well, we have actually worked with the customs people, and in fact, I am planning to do just that. We border on Canada, and already we had a hearing in Montpelier, Vermont, well attended, and a number of folks were coming up and they saying, you know, Bernie, we go over the border. We have a particular problem. The drug there is 50%. So we are going to organize a little bit of a trip to our neighbors to the north and bring back some prescription drugs. And the goal of all of that is to highlight the absurdity, the outrageous situation that and let's reiterate this once again in case people get confused. We're not talking about generics. We're not talking about lookalikes. We are talking about the same exact product, often in the same exact bottle, sold all over the world at significantly lower prices in the United States, and we are going to do something to change that situation. I am tired of seeing. We are also asking for a study. Can you imagine how many folks, in fact, have died in this country because they can't afford the prescription drugs? Can you imagine the absurdity of elderly people or sick people in general not being able to pay relatively small sums for their prescription drugs? What happens when they are ill? They end up in emergency rooms, they end up in the hospital, and Medicare kicks in thousands of dollars that could have been saved if these folks had their prescription drug in the first place. Bottom line of this situation is that people are dying, people are suffering, while pharmaceutical companies are enjoying record-breaking profits and spending their cash all over Washington trying to prevent the Congress from doing the right thing. And Peter DeFazio and I are going to do our best to turn the tables and finally give the American healthcare consumer a break, and we're going to save lives, and we're going to ease suffering, and we're going to finally help lead the effort in standing up to this very, very greedy industry. I would yield to my friend.
I don't want to get too far afield, but I think at this point, as I said earlier, I would like just to address the issues of trade a little bit, because we do seem to have these kind of strange standards. If it would benefit American consumers to be able to purchase their drugs, the exact same drugs, manufactured mostly in America, in Puerto Rico for the most part, in Canada. Seems trade law doesn't allow that. But if an American firm wants to export jobs, export capital, if an American firm wants to blackmail their suppliers into moving to Mexico to get cheaper labor, now that's okay. It's kind of an odd world. I mean, when are the American consumers and workers going to truly come out ahead on trade, or is it all just about corporate profits and driving down wages in this country? I've got to believe that that maybe is more the agenda. I just, I've been watching for years our trade balance, and we're headed toward a record trade deficit this year. The funny thing is that the Commerce Department loves to talk about trade and how much trade benefits American people. And they say, hey, every $1 billion of trade is worth 20,000 jobs. But if you're running a $200 billion trade deficit and you apply the ruler of our own Commerce Department, that means we've just lost a lot of jobs.
Is the gentleman actually suggesting that we should look at both sides of the equation? Now, that is a radical concept.
Well, they don't, but I think that if we just want, they want to use the ruler for our exports, let's use the ruler on the imports, which exceed our exports by $200 million. So then you multiply 200 times 20,000. I'm not really very good at math, but it seems like that's going to come out to about a lot of jobs, like probably a job for just about every American who would want one, and then more. But, our greatest trade deficit has been with Japan, but that probably will be eclipsed this year by China. And the extraordinary thing is, of course, we've got a few problems with the way the Chinese behave in the international community. They are identified as the least fair trading nation on earth. They have been identified as a nation that provides weapons and nuclear technology to rogue states. They've committed a few human rights abuses, running over students with tanks and a few other things, have, basically destroyed the country of Tibet and taken it into their country. Of course, we said nothing about that because it would interfere with business. Well, what are we so desperate about in terms of business? We're running an $80 billion trade deficit with the Chinese. An $80 billion trade deficit is what we're headed toward this year. What do they do with that money? They use that money to go around the world and buy technology to become our economic and military competitor in the next century. Credibly, they're using American dollars. They allow, in a few critical American goods where they can use the technology, but for the most part, they keep our goods out. But their goods are flooding in to the United States. And now the president apparently is going to propose making this situation permanent, to give China permanent, most favored nation status. And secondly, to allow them to get into the World Trade Organization, because the theory is someday, somehow, we'll whip them into line and they'll drop all those trade barriers and we'll start to sell them Coca-Cola or something else in the billions, and we'll make a lot of money. But right now, it's just a few American corporations that are in China making a bundle of money, trying to drive down wages here. Boeing has time and time again threatened to export jobs to China, to their workers here in the United States as they export the technology. Of course, Chinese say, don't worry, we won't build airplanes. We're not going to use your technology in any critical way. And then, of course, they lied again. Yes?
The gentleman forgets one very important point. China is a very good place to do business. It's a wonderful place to do business. Why would you want to pay an American worker $15 an hour or $20 an hour? Why would you have to live up and obey environmental standards and work safety standards? Why would you have to deal with workers who might actually be members of unions? Why would you want to deal with workers who have the freedom to vote and to elect or unelect their officials when you can go to China and pay workers 20 cents an hour, 25 cents an hour, where workers can't form unions, where workers can't go out on strike, where workers can't protect their safety on the job? It is an absolute outrage, prima facie, right on the surface, that you have tens of billions of dollars being invested in China by the largest American corporations, who at the same exact time have laid off millions of American workers, and they're going there because they can pay desperate people slave wages. And that is the essence of our trade policy, which is what, $200 billion deficit this year? And yet when you hear the administration or you hear the Chamber of Commerce or the National Association of Manufacturing, they tell us about all the jobs that we're creating by exporting. And as you just indicated a moment ago, they forget to tell us about the millions of jobs that we have lost. Not only have we lost jobs, but another very important factor is taking place. And that is that if an employer has the option to run to Mexico and pay a desperate person there 50 cents an hour through NAFTA, or runs to China and pays a worker there 20 cents an hour, what do we think this does to the wage structure in the United States? All over this country, workers are given a proposition. They say, either you're going to take a wage cut, take cuts in your health insurance, or we're going to move to Mexico, we're going to move to China. So our whole trade policy has not only cost us jobs, it has lowered wages in the United States. And I would yield back to my friend.
Well, we just do need to expand on that point a little bit. You know, the fact that these companies are chasing the lowest labor around the world and the least enforcement. You know, I saw, not to be humorous about a serious subject, but I saw a cartoon once, and it was one guy asked another guy, he said, well, why do you think it is we're spending all this money on NASA, National Aeronautics and Space Administration? And the other guy said, well, because we know somewhere out there in the universe there are people who work for less than $1 a day. You know, I mean, it's kind of a sad commentary, but unfortunately there is some truth in it. Under this guise of free trade, American corporations are chasing around the world, and multinational corporations, after the cheapest labor from the most desperate people or from children, as we've seen in many countries, where children are exploited in horrible conditions as young as age 7 and 8 in some countries, basically indentured into their jobs, deprived of an education or any opportunity to get ahead, to make products that are marketed in the United States and other developed countries. And trade law doesn't allow us to prohibit those goods from coming into our country.
You're not suggesting that we should interfere with quote-unquote free trade just because we're importing products made by children who are virtual slaves. The gentleman is not suggesting that, is he?
Well, I understand that it's not the policy of this Congress or this administration to interfere in those workings of the market, but as an individual member of Congress and someone who's concerned about humanity worldwide, I kind of would like to see us take a stand there. I mean, slave labor, prison labor, child labor, it seems to me these are sort of basic things that should be allowed and should be part of your trade policy. Project your values. And, yeah, this is even more radical to talk about maybe looking toward the people at home and protecting their jobs. Now, I say, oh, well, you're talking about protectionism. I say, no, I'm just talking about leveling the playing field. Let's not have unfair competition. Let's not let American firms go south of the border and dump their pollutants out the back door into the rivers in Mexico. Let's have them follow the same environmental laws there. Let's allow the Mexican people to organize and strike and not be bullied or even killed sometimes by their own government because they're trying to organize and help their wages. If we get level playing field, then workers all around the world will benefit, and I think these companies will ultimately do well too. They forget something. In America, in our country, we had kind of a compact. As the middle class grew, the companies did better because they could consume the goods. They seem to have forgotten that now, because with families desperate more and more to make ends meet, they're becoming less and less capable. Go ahead.
Now the gentleman raises an interest and has led us in an interesting direction. And he talks about families making ends meet. But wait a second, I looked at the newspaper this morning and I watched television. We are in the greatest economic boom in the history of this country. Is the gentleman suggesting that not all of the people in Oregon or in Vermont are doing extraordinarily well? Gee, that's what I saw on television. What is the reality of this great economic boom? You know, when I speak in the state of Vermont, I go from one end of our state to the other. And I talk to a lot of middle-class audiences and working-class audiences. I talk to family farmers. I always ask one question. I start off, and I would like to ask the people of America this question. And that is, you see on the television and you read in the newspaper that the economy is booming. So my question is the economy booming for you? And in the state of Vermont, you ask the question of 300 people in the audience, you know, 1 or 2 people raise their hands. What does a booming economy mean? A booming economy for you means that you're making more money and working fewer hours. That's what a booming, you have better health care. You're better able to send your kids to college. Your housing situation is better. What is the reality? Well, let me say first the good news, and we have to be honest about this. The good news is that last year, Bill Gates had a very good year, and I mean a very good year. Bill saw his wealth increase by $40 billion. Increase up to $90 billion. What is $40 billion? Let me put it in a context. In my state of Vermont, which is a small state, we have our entire state budget, which covers all of the needs of the people of 580,000 people of the state of Vermont. It is a little over $1 billion. That means that in Gates's increase in wealth in 1 year could run the state of Vermont for 40 years, which brings them to a total, by the way, of $90 billion. So Gates had a good year. What about the average American? Let's go over some facts here. During the period of 1979 through the present, the growth in income has disproportionately flowed to the top. The bottom 60% of the population actually saw their real income, that's inflation accounted income, decrease in 1990 dollars. The top 20% saw modest gains, but the wealthiest 1% saw their incomes explode over 80%. In other words, when you talk about the great economic boom, most people today are worse off in terms of what they earn than they were in 1979. People are working longer hours for lower wages, and a lot of that reason has to do with the absurd trade policy that you described. People can't. We have 43 million Americans with no health insurance. And here's a fact that is not very much discussed. Today, the average American is working 160 hours a year more than was the case 20 years ago. We had hoped as we entered the 20th century, remember the unions were saying 40 hours. They wanted a 40-hour work week 100 years ago. That's what workers were fighting for. Today, you're lucky to find a worker who's only working 40 hours. People are working 50, 60 hours. People are working 2 jobs, 3 jobs. So how do you have an economy booming when people are forced to work 50 or 60 hours at wages less than was the case 20 years ago, when they don't have health insurance and they can't afford their basic needs? And I would yield to my friend.
Well, I actually had, I talked to a lot of people in Oregon in different places, and I just remember one young man. I pulled into the gas station late one night after I flew back across the country, as I do almost every week. And he was kind of almost apologetic about it. He recognized me, and he said, I got to tell you, Congressman, he says, I'm not doing too good. I'm not making it. He said, and Oregon has the highest minimum wage in the United States. And guess what? Our economy is booming. All the companies haven't fled the state as we heard they would with the highest minimum wage in the country. But he said, I got 2 jobs. My wife's got a job. And he said, we're really not making it. We want to have a kid. And we're not really sure we can afford to have a kid, because he says, I got 2 minimum wage jobs at the Oregon minimum wage, highest in the United States. My wife's got a minimum wage job. He says, but there's, after we pay the rent and the car payment and the other stuff, he says, there's not much left over. And that is the unfortunate reality for many Americans in this. There have been a lot of jobs created, but compare the salaries and wages and benefits of those jobs. The largest employer in the United States of America now is not General Motors, it's not even Microsoft. It is something called Manpower, Inc., which is a temporary employment firm with no benefits and obviously very little security and not the greatest wages in the world for most of the people they place. That's the largest employer in America. There's something wrong with that picture. It goes to trade policy, it goes to tax policy, it goes back to who funds the elections in this country. I mean, there are a whole host of things contributing to this. It's very complex. It also goes to the Federal Reserve Board, who are a bunch of bankers who meet downtown at the largest, heaviest, most expensive marble and exotic hardwood table in the world, in secret, by the way, to determine monetary policy for the United States of America. And now they're obsessed. They are obsessed. It's now, will a one-state rate increase satisfy the Fed? What are they worried about? Another cartoon. I saw it. There's all these old guys. They're pretty much older guys, bankers and stuff, standing around behind Frankenstein, who's tied down. Frankenstein's label as inflation. One of them says, his eyelid twitched. His little toe moved. I think he's starting to breathe. They're worried about inflation that doesn't exist. The lowest real rate of inflation in the last 50 years in the United States. Highest real interest rates, though, if you borrow money. And guess what? If there was a little bit more inflation, debtors, which is most of the people in America, the ones certainly I care the most about. Everybody's got a credit card, a mortgage, a home loan, a car loan. If inflation ticked up 0.5% or 1%, guess what? You come out a little bit ahead, but your banker loses a little bit on the margin. So the obsession is we've got to worry that wages might go up. The Fed is petrified that wages might go up. We have a law that says we're supposed to work toward full employment and keep down inflation. They don't look at the full employment side, and they particularly look negatively upon the idea of a real increase in wages. They don't want that to happen. And they're willing to drive up interest rates, which raises the credit card of virtually every American who's got credit card debt, makes your car loans more expensive, makes housing loans more expensive, because they're worried that the profits of the banks, that some of them who actually sit there and make policy in secret work for, might go down a little bit. This is a very strange system we're running here. What happened to the policymakers? What happened to the Congress? What happened to the president? Why can't we make monetary policy to drive up wages in this country, to create full employment? Why are those things anathema? Something is very wrong. Why can they make policy in secret? How can they do this?
My friend obviously misses the main point about what the function of the United States Congress is supposed to be. Does the gentleman not think that the function of the Congress is to represent the interest of the large banks and the rich? Does he really have the radical idea that the United States Congress is supposed to represent the vast majority of the people, the working people, the elderly people, the people who are struggling? He forgets. Those are not the people who contribute $50,000 a plate at fundraising dinners. So those are not the people who are going to get a fair shake. My friend will allow, I want to quote something from a very interesting book. It's called Shifting Fortunes, The Perils of the Growing American Wealth Gap by Chuck Collins and some other people. And it touches on an issue that we very rarely talk about, and that is the fact that the United States has by far the greatest disparity of wealth and income in the industrialized world, that we now have the obscene situation where the wealthiest 1% of the population owns more wealth than the bottom 95%. And in the book, and let me quote it, he says the top 1% of households have soared, while most Americans have been working harder to stay in place, if they have not fallen further behind. Now, this is not income. This is altogether what you own, wealth. Since the 1970s, the top 1% of households have doubled their share of the national wealth at the expense of everyone else. The top 1% have doubled their share of the national wealth. Using data from the Federal Reserve Survey of Consumer Finances, economist Edward Wolf of New York University says that the top 1% had 40% of the nation's household wealth as of 1997. The top 1% of households have more wealth than the bottom 95%. And in fact, what we're seeing today is a greater concentration of wealth than at any time in the modern history of this country, and I would yield back to my friend.
Well, that goes, and there are some policy issues at stake here. We talked about trade, and we won't go back to that, but we could have a trade policy that helped in those areas. But the other issue is tax policy. The majority party here in the House very much wants to give a tax break to the American people. And the question becomes, first off, are they going to give that tax break out of the Social Security surplus? That's a question and a problem. Or are they going to give a tax break by cutting programs like Pell Grants and other things the gentleman talked about? Again, but maybe it can be justified, but you can only justify if you look and see where those tax benefits are going to flow. There are ways that we can provide substantial tax relief to the majority of the American people, but I fear, as in the last several tax bills since I've been here, the wealth and what they're talking about, the people at the top are going to do very well, and those average people aren't. I mean, they want to talk about reducing they want to reduce the capital gains tax again. Now, this is not quite clear to me, but let's see if I totally understand this. If I invest for a living, my effective tax rate is just slightly more than half of a retail unionized checkout clerk or a teacher. Is that correct? A teacher's paying at 28% on the margin, and if I do capital gains, I don't have them, so I don't know, but I think it's 18 or 19%, as I recall.
Yes.
So what are we saying to the American people? If you're out there, is this like the Leona Helmsley theory of taxation? Only the little people pay taxes? I mean, they're talking about a world in which they would do away with the inheritance tax, and let's say you were lucky enough to be Bill Gates' kids, but he says he's going to give most of the money away, not to his kid. But maybe he only gives his kid $1 billion. So his kid only gets $1 billion. You know, the other $89 billion goes to charity. That would be nice. But then the kid goes to college, and invests that $1 billion and becomes an investor for a living. Doesn't work for wages. Guess what? That person would not pay any inheritance taxes under the brave new world of tax reform they're talking about, and would pay no income taxes because they would exempt capital gains from income taxes. So the guy selling the burgers down at the corner, well, they're paying FICA tax, Social Security, they're paying income tax. You know, they're subject to all these taxes, but the person who inherited and invests for a living doesn't. What's wrong with this picture? If they want to talk about leveling the playing field, why should it be that people who invest for a living pay a lower rate of taxes than people who earn through blood, sweat, and tears and time away from their home and their families wages? Let's equalize the two. Why wouldn't we do that? What is wrong with that idea? Wouldn't that help most people?
It makes a lot of sense to me. But unfortunately, those people who make $10 or $12 an hour are not making the huge contributions to both political parties and to their members of Congress or to the United States Senate. Now, the gentleman a moment ago, and maybe we can get back to this point, touched on a very important issue that I do not think is widely known by the American people. And that is, you know, when some of our friends talk about taxes, and they talk about income taxes, 2 points to be made. Number one, when you hear somebody on television saying, let's have an across-the-board reduction in income tax. Sounds pretty good. But please understand that the bulk of those tax breaks are going to go to upper income people. Now, Peter a moment ago touched on the FICA tax and Social Security. It seems to me that if we want to make our tax system a bit fairer and protect middle income and working families, we might want to take a hard look at the Social Security tax, which is extremely regressive. As you said a moment ago, somebody makes $1 billion a year, somebody makes $72,000 a year. Who contributes more into the Social Security system? Answer, they both contribute exactly the same. A worker making $20,000 a year pays 6.2%. Somebody making $1 million a year pays 6.2% on the first $72,000. Very regressive system. And I know that you have brought forth a proposal which is far more progressive, and maybe you might want to say a word on it, which not only protects middle income and low income workers, but it does something else very interesting. When we hear all of our friends here telling us how Social Security is falling apart, your approach would extend the life of Social Security for many years. Would you like to say that?
Well, it's pretty simple. They're talking about destroying the system to save it, moving toward a privatized sink or swim on your own system. But there's one simple fact. If we just lifted the cap and said every American will pay the same amount of Social Security tax on all their wages, that sounds pretty fair to me. It's not progressive even. It's not progressive. We're not saying low-income people will pay less. We're saying everybody will pay the same amount on every dollar. That would provide more than enough money to make Social Security solvent beyond the 75-year window. But I went a step further in my bill. I said, okay, well, I like that. That's pretty good. You know, we don't have to cut benefits, raise the retirement age, or do things that hurt working people. And we don't have to roll a dice on some sort of individualized accounts, which haven't worked out real well in Great Britain and in Chile. But what we could do also is exempt the first $4,000 of income. I'd like to give a little tax relief. So the plan I have would lift the cap and use some of that money to provide tax relief by exempting the first $4,000 of income for self-employed and for wage-earning Americans who pay FICA taxes. Now, guess what that means? That means 95% of the people in the United States of America who work for wages would get a tax cut, and they would still collect their full Social Security. But 5%, those who earn over $76,600 a year, would pay the same amount as the other people who earned less than them. Now, wouldn't that be a fairer way to fix Social Security?
Well, let me interrupt you. What you're suggesting is that your proposal would lower taxes for 95% of the American people, and in fact would provide a very substantial tax break for lower-income working people, and at the same time you would be able to extend the life of Social Security for the 75 years that the actuaries think we need. Is that what you're saying?
That's correct.
Now, that sounds like a pretty good proposal to me. And let us see how many of our colleagues here who tell us day after day how the Social Security system is going bankrupt, which certainly is not true. Let's see how many of them are going to join us in that type of approach.
I thank the gentleman. In fact, I went before the Ways and Means Committee. They would only accept bills that the actuaries had certified as meeting the 75-year requirement. So they only had testimony, I believe, on 5 pieces of legislation before the Ways and Means Committee, and mine was one of the 5 certified by the trustees of Social Security. And the chairman was also, I believe, for a flat tax. He didn't just like latch onto it. I said, well, Mr. Chairman, this has got to be right down your alley. This is a flat tax. People are going to pay the same if they earn $1 million a year, if they earn $75,000, $76,000 a year. Wouldn't that be fair? And we fix the system, and we don't have to go through this whole disassembly and reassembly and rolling the dice and taking chances on whether something else would work. And whether the something else that they might put in place is Social Security, the system that is responsible for lifting millions of Americans, older Americans out of poverty, disabled Americans out of poverty, survivors of workers who died at a young age. We would lose or risk all that in the newly, fractioned, independent sort of account kind of system. A few people would do better, but most would not. So here's an option that would provide tax relief and save the system, but it just somehow didn't capture the chairman's attention right off. I don't intend to drop the idea. I've got final legislation. I'm ready to introduce it soon, and I'm hoping to begin a debate about a better way to fix Social Security.
Well, we're running out of time, and I want to thank Congressman Peter DeFazio for joining me this evening. And I think the bottom line of this whole discussion is the following, is that unless ordinary people, working people, middle-income people, young people get actively involved in the political process and begin and stand up and fight for social justice, then what will happen is that the people who have the money, the people who make the campaign contributions, they will continue to call the tune here in the Congress and in the administration. And what will happen is that the policies, whether they are trade policies, health care policies, prescription drug policies, labor policies, environmental policies, whatever, those policies will be heavily influenced by the interests of those people who have the money, and they will work against the interests of the vast majority of the people. Bottom line of this whole discussion is that we are a great and wealthy nation. And if we all stood together, became actively involved in the political process, we could create a society in where every man, woman, and child had a decent standard of living. That is not utopian vision. That is concrete reality. That's what we could do. We could join the rest of the industrialized world and provide health care to every man, woman, and child, including prescription drugs. We will not do that unless people stand up and be prepared to fight for what's right. And I just want to thank Peter DeFazio for joining me this evening.
I thank the gentleman.
Yield back the balance of my time.
Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 6, 1999, the Chair recognized the gentleman from New York.